is how's your granddaughter doing?
Grandson.
Grandson doing, sorry.
He's doing great. He is so amazing. He's just a beautiful little boy, and he's looking more and more like my son all the time. I'm sure his mother is like slightly chagrined at the moment, but you know, things change all the time. But he's a cool little kid, smiles a lot, and because of COVID, he gets lots of attention. You know, the adults in his life who would probably be going out and doing jobs somewhere are not. They are there with him. You know, so he gets lots of attention.
Just in case you weren't with us the last time Joel joined us for one of these tastings, he stood in for his son, Morgan, who owns a winery called another great winery called Bedrock, because Morgan's was having a baby maybe that night, and Joel stood in for him. I think it was like 3 days later when the baby decided to make an appearance. And what's his name?
His name is Joel.
Joel. Wow. Well,
they named him after me. We call him JP, so there's no confusion.
Well,
but apparently he's Joel Jr.
He's got big shoes to fill.
I was a little overwhelmed when they told me that. So it's quite the honor, you know, to have your son think enough of you so he's willing to name his son after you.
Yeah. Well, I know you'll be a great grandfather.
I'm doing my best. I carry him around and talk to him whenever I can.
Bartholomew Broadbent told us the story of, you know, being served first growth Bordeaux's when he was 11 years old. So I don't, maybe Joel, maybe JP will be served great Zinfandel when it seems appropriate. So
I'm sure he will. Morgan certainly early.
So I hope everyone, we're going to start with the Mataro, and I hope everyone, number one, if you have all three wines, I would open all three and pour yourself a glass or a taste of the Mataro, which is the wine we'll start with tonight. And and so Joel, talk about, and we've been talking about this a little bit already, but talk about why Zinfandel back then when you decided to be the world's most important winemaker. I mean, you know, I had never thought, let me digress. I had never thought about this, but you were selling 1 million cases of a wine a year that was actually a pretty serious wine. I mean, it wasn't schlock, right? It wasn't apothic or any of those kind of wines. It was real wine. It had business character.
And I was making another, you know, 15 to 20,000 cases of wine that was even more serious, single vineyard designated wine and county series wines that were all Zinfandel for the most part.
But how many wineries, how many wines are there in the world that there are 1 million cases a year of that are actually decent, you know? Maybe Veuve Clicquot Yellow Label would be the one that jumps to mind, but or I don't know. Other than that, I mean, how really something Penfolds makes maybe.
Dom Perignon's pretty big.
Yeah, well,
nobody knows how big Dom Perignon is, but it's pretty damn big. Yeah, so yeah, not too many.
Yeah. I mean, that's an accomplishment.
You know, yeah, and it's partly because big wineries are usually corporate and usually don't have one winemaker in charge that have sort of built it from the beginning. So there was one vision at Ravenswood, which makes it a little bit different. So why Zinfandel?
Before that, excuse me for interrupting. Yeah. But before that, I'm going to mute everyone, and you will need to unmute yourself. So, Joel, if you would unmute yourself so we can hear you.
Unmute. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, beautiful.
Okay. So, so why Zinfandel? So when I started making wine, I didn't know what I wanted to make. I'd grown up. My father taught me to taste wine when I was 10 years old. Actually, you know, almost professionally. And we tasted a lot of European wines, mostly Bordeaux and Burgundy and some Italian wines, lots of German wines. And I kind of accidentally got in the wine business. I was a wine aficionado, and I had wine groups, and I wrote about wine, but I was a medical researcher by by training and proclivity. And I was at a wine tasting at one point, and was sitting next to a guy named Joseph Swan, and we got into a conversation. And I was showing off. I basically identified 12 wines out of 12 in a flight, blind, and he said, "Can you teach me to do that?" And I said, "Sure, why not? Give me 6 years." And I was totally tongue in cheek. And he said, "Well, I've got 6 years." And he said, "Do you have any building skills? I'm building a winery. Maybe you can help me out." And that was the beginning of an amazing sort of a situation where I would go up and spend all my weekends and vacations with Joe and help him build his winery. And in exchange, he basically taught me how to prune grapevines. And I made wine with him. And ultimately, in 1976, I started my own wine. But Joe made, he wanted to make Pinot Noir and Chardonnay. He was in the Russian River Valley. But in 1968, he made a wine from an old vine Zinfandel patch that was on his property that he subsequently tore up, unfortunately, put in Pinot Noir. That was legendary. Now, I'd tasted lots of wines. I'd tasted thousands of wines up to that point. And I tasted this wine and I said, my God, if this is California Zinfandel, then I need to know more about it. So when I learned more about Zinfandel, I found out that it was a grape variety that was really California's first dominant grape variety besides the mission grape. It really arrived here in 1852, and by 1888, it was the most important and most planted grape in California. And that some of California's best wines pre-Prohibition had been made primarily from this grape, but they also had other grape varieties mixed into the vineyards. So I began going out and looking for wines that were like that and other people who were making wines like that. And I thought, wow, so if I believed in the European model, which said wines come from a place, they're paired with that place, like Bordeaux is with Cabernet and Merlot and Cabernet Franc, and Pinot Noir is with Burgundy, then the only grape we have in California that's not ersatz European wine is Zinfandel. At that point, we didn't know where it came from. It was kind of the mystery grape at that point. But it was clearly a grape that had adapted to California's climate and done really well. And when made seriously, when made with a conscious effort to make good wine, it made really great wine. I mean, Joe Swan made great wine with that vineyard almost by accident. He said, well, I want to practice making my Pinot Noir. So I'm going to treat this wine just like I'm going to treat my Pinot Noir. I'm going to put it in small fermenters. I'm going to punch it down by hand. I'm going to put it in French oak. I mean, basically did the whole thing like as if he were making a Pinot Noir. And it became such a stunningly good wine that he continued making Zinfandel, even though he began making Pinot Noir. And ultimately he made Zinfandel from the Teldeschi Vineyard, or which was the Mike Teldeschi Vineyard, which is right next vineyard we're having tonight. So I got into Zinfandel because I thought it was the right grape for California, and nobody, with the possible exception of Ridge, was doing it, and I didn't feel like competing with Robert Mondavi.
No, you wouldn't want to. You wouldn't want to compete with Mr. Mondavi. I mean, you would want advice from Mr. Mondavi. You'd want friendship with Robert Mondavi, but you wouldn't want to compete with him. That's for sure.
Yeah, I don't consider anybody in the wine business competition, and that's not my ego speaking. I consider them collaboration. We all work together quite closely and help each other out when we can, for the most part. Yeah, there are exceptions to that, but
I mean, early on, learning to grow Zinfandel and learning to make high quality wine from Zinfandel with Joseph Swan. That's like going to Harvard to study law or something. It's about the highest level that you could learn from, right? I mean, he was.
Well, at the time, it is absolutely true, and it was not because Joe really wanted to be there doing that. You know, his consultant was Andrei Telechef. They were good friends, and we spent a number of days or evenings over a dinner table drinking wine together. And Telechef was very eager to have him make Pinot Noir because, as you know, Telechef had, was instrumental in pushing Pinot Noir as a cool climate grape. And the Russian River Valley, that area around Forestville, which is considered to be the golden triangle for Pinot Noir, was exactly what Andre had in mind. But he was also enthralled with Joe Zinfandel and basically said to me, if you want to make your mark on the world, make great Zinfandel. Yeah.
Talk about Andrei Telechef, since you knew him, and there a diminishing number of people that would have known him in their lives. Could you talk to him a little bit about what his place in wine history is? I mean,
well, Andrei Telechef came to California in the early 40s. He had been working at Montpellier, but more than that, he was a white Russian. He had been driven out of Russia and found a home in France and found a home in the wine business. And he was really moving up in the ranks at Montpellier when Georges de la Tour found him.
Montpellier,
And,
you're talking about the university at Montpellier, right?
yeah, I am, yes.
Yeah, and yeah.
And Georges de la Tour was the proprietor of Beaulieu Vineyards, BV as we called it for short. And he convinced Andre that he needed somebody that was really talented in California. And for whatever the reason, Andre decided he'd come. And so he shows up in 1942. I think that was the year he came in. And of course, it was the war years. Maybe that was one of the reasons he left France. And he made his first wine in 1943. And I had the great pleasure of tasting with him and a group of other people a vertical of BV wines, Georges de la Tour wines. And I found that one in my father's cellar. It was marked sample for sampling only, not for commercial sale. And we tasted these wines blind, and it won the tasting. And Andre said, I thought I'd never taste that wine again. And besides that, he said, I thought it would never be ready, but here it is. And he explained how in 43, it was so cold, he had to, and there was no labor to speak of. So he and Dimitri picked many grapes as they could, but the grapes were nearly frozen. He had to light fires in the winery to warm up the fermenter. He had to ferment it. He didn't have a crusher, so he fermented everything on the skins and stems. He says it was virtually undrinkable when it was done. Yeah. He said, I don't even know how your father got a bottle of that, but many years later, this tasting would have taken place in the early 90s. Yeah, so that would have been 43 to early, so it would have been at least 50 years old. It was pretty stunning. So Andre, when I knew him, was still working at BV. He was almost ADD. He was like very hyperactive, and he always had something to say. And he had a heavy Russian accent, so sometimes you couldn't entirely understand him. And he smoked incessantly. He would keep 3 cigarettes going at the same time. I once said to him, Andre, I said, how can you taste anything? You smoke so much. He said, my wife, Dorothy, made me stop smoking for a while and almost ruined my career. He said, I've been smoking since I was a young boy. He said, everything I've ever tasted has been underneath the guise of cigarette smoke. He said, so when you take it away, he says, I have no idea what I'm tasting. So I have to smoke to taste.
Clive Coates,
I'd never heard.
Clive Coates, the great Burgundy writer, well, among other things, but, you know, really known for his coverage of Burgundy, told me once that if he has a really, really important tasting plan, he always gets really drunk the night before because his palate is much more engaged when he has a hangover.
And I'll bet you he's a lot.
It's much more sensitive. It's much more sensitive when he has a hangover. So he always gets really drunk the night before an important tasting.
I don't think I've ever tried that technique. I don't think I'm going to adopt it.
I don't either.
But Andre was super knowledgeable, and he stayed in the wine business really till the very end. Even after he left BV, he consulted for lots of wineries. I would run into him periodically in a number of different places. He consulted for Buena Vista and Rodney Strong and lots of people. Very, very diligent, very active. And for a guy who smoked as much as he did, he lived a very long and productive life. Interesting man. Very nice guy, actually. Although, let's just say he was a little hands-on when it came to the women, even late in his life. Carol Sheldon has some very...
He and Mike Gergich, famously, you don't, if you're an attractive woman, you don't really want to get too close to them.
Carol Sheldon has some very funny stories about working with Andre, but she took it all in good stride.
Marvin Overton told me a story about a half bottle of Lacre Christi from the, I don't know, 16th century or something like that, that Tawfik Khoury bought at auction from the Wellington cellar. And did you know about that wine and taste by any chance?
No, I've never.
I know Andre did.
Yeah.
Supposedly, I don't know. The story was, I don't want to get too off topic, but I thought you might have tasted it since you're part of that group. But I can't remember exactly how old it was. It was a half bottle of, you know, Italian sparkling sweet wine that was maybe 400 years old or something when Tawfik Khoury bought it. And but then he thought, you know, how do you open a 400-year-old half bottle of sparkling sweet white wine? And a friend of his had the brilliant idea of not opening it, to insert a syringe, the needle of a syringe, through the cork into the wine, kind of like the original Coravin.
The original Coravin, so, exactly.
He would extract a couple of drops for people and put it in their glass and let them smell it. And,
nope, never had that pleasure.
Yeah, supposedly it was absolutely spectacular.
Yeah. So anyway, Andre was an interesting person, and he really changed the face of the California wine business because he understood barrels and small lot production and vineyards in a way that up to that point nobody else had. He really was kind of the seminal force in making BV as good as it was, and ultimately he trained a lot of other people. The Mondavis learned a lot from him. Even Warren Winiarski and Stag's Leap. They were all in debt to Andre.
Well, he kind of set the groundwork for people like Robert Mondavi and Warren Winiarski, people that had this idea that they might make great wine, but I mean, there was a history of great wine. Inglenook and BV in the 40s and 50s made great wine, right?
Yeah, they did, but they were not wines that were what we would consider to be modern wines, right. Or wines. Modern wines and great wines tend to be made in small cooperage. A lot of those wines were done in upright redwood tanks, and and while they tasted great, sometime later you could still smell a little bit of the redwood in them. One of the best old wines I ever had from California was a Petit Syrah from Larkmead from 1933, and it was amazing in terms of its aroma and its resilience. But you could still smell the redwood. It still had that kind of like earthy quality that redwood, earthy cedary quality that redwood gives wines.
I mean,
Pretty amazing.
I tasted the 51 BV Private Reserve in probably the mid 90s, and it was magnificent.
Yeah, I'm sure. Andre made great wines then, and he continued to make them. He was using American oak, and he was using small oak cooperage. So, like I say, he moved the winery in a much more traditional, though what we consider to be modern winemaking direction than the other wineries in Napa Valley were.
Well, I mean, thank God for him. None of it may have happened with. I mean, you think about that. How much of it goes back to one man, and then 3 or 4 men, kind of like a family tree. It all kind of all starts with, well, it starts with Junipero Serra, and then it goes down to Telechef. Mondavi and Warminyarsky and.
Yeah, well, the Prohibition pushed the pause button, or we would have been there a lot earlier. There were some great winemakers pre-Prohibition. Colin Forling had a great winemaker. There were some people who did really excellent wines pre-Prohibition, but basically the pause button was pushed. We lost a whole generation of winemakers really during that era. So really almost had to start over, almost had to train the American drinking audience how to taste wine again and how to understand wine that wasn't sweet or jug or or somehow defective, because there was a lot of home winemaking that went on during that period of time.
Have you tasted much wine from before Prohibition?
Not a lot. I've tasted, obviously tasted more European wine pre-Prohibition than California wine. I've tasted some old Rixford, some of the other, some Hallcrest. There were a couple of others, but not a lot. And most of them are shadows of what they probably were, but the fact that they still cast a shadow that's pretty tasty means that the wine must have been pretty interesting in the beginning.
So tell us about thank you very much. Thank you very much.
So
sorry, I'm getting some praise from an important customer, so I got distracted there for a moment. Thank you. Tell us about the Mataro, please.
Mataro is interesting because Mataro came to California sometime in the late 1800s, like 1880 or so, and it must have been planted in this vineyard shortly thereafter. Mataro is also Morvet or Monastrell, and it's frequently planted as a grape mixed with Zinfandel, but this particular vineyard was planted almost pure Mataro. It's got a little bit of Carignan and a little bit of Zinfandel in it, probably less than 5%. But the really amazing thing about this vineyard is that they're grapevines planted on their own roots. So most grapevines after phylloxera were grafted onto American rootstock. And as we know, American rootstock or rootstock in general for anything like lemon trees or orange trees, etc., change the growth nature of the vine or the tree. But so these are vines were grown pre-phylloxera. And the reason that can happen is because they're planted in really sandy soils. These soils look like you're walking on sand dunes. They're honestly, they're quite amazing. And this is on a slope. So when I'm doing the sampling, it's like 1 step forward, 2 steps back. Maybe not that bad, but but it's pretty loose soil. And the afternoon in this area gets wind. So this is an area that's out behind Mount Diablo in Contra Costa County. It would be excruciatingly hot in the afternoon, too hot really for growing grapes, except for this wind that blows up across the Sassoon Bay and carries this cool wind in across the vineyard in the afternoon, starting about 1 or 2 o'clock. And basically the grapevines just shut down. They close their stoma and they protect themselves, which saves them really from the afternoon sun. So this is an area where it warms up a little earlier. The sandy soils warm up a little earlier, so the grapevines bud out earlier. Uh, and then they have this mostly growing season in the morning when it's cooler, and they ripen about a week and a half to 2 weeks before grapes I pick in Sonoma. Um, but their vines were planted in probably 1895, probably by Portuguese immigrants. Um, and they have survived a long time in part because they produce really interesting wine. I share this vineyard with Tegan Pasalacqua, who is the winemaker at Turley, but he has his own label called Sandlands that he uses this grape. These grapes formerly were used by Randall Graham when he was making his Cote d'Oakley. It was part of the, these were part of the blends. So the vineyard is really, I think, one of the best vineyards in Oakley. My son owns a vineyard called Evangelo, which is also excellent and has a really interesting mix of grapes. This vineyard has Mataro, Zinfandel, and some Carignan in it. I make a Zinfandel from this vineyard as well. The own roots and the sandy soils create these really graceful wines that have really pretty fruit characters, but also have almost silky tannins relative to some other wines you might taste. So they're super well balanced, and they're very pretty, and they're very drinkable now, but I have the sense that they will go for a long time. These wines are made like I make all my wines in small open top fermenters, punched down by hand, native yeast fermentations, some variable amount of French oak from a particular cooper. This happens to be Hermitage cooperage, medium plus toast Nevers, and it's about 30% new French. So made really classically. Really, my winemaking these days focuses on getting the precise flavor of place and vintage in a wine.
The three wines we're tasting tonight, the production combined is less than 800 cases. Is that correct?
That's correct. If you wonder what the if you wonder about the stats on these wines, if you look at the back of the bottle, it has all the information on it. This particular,
I think it's 200 plus, 200 plus, and 300 plus.
358 cases made. This is a winemaker's back label. You know, I worked for a very large wine company for a very long time, and I watched them spend vast quantities of money on having people spin back labels for them with all sorts of poetry and prettiness. And I thought, you know, none of that is important, and most of it is phony. Really, what I want to know as a winemaker is what the acid and what the pH are and how many bottles were made and where the vineyard was and all that kind of stuff. So there's not a lot of glamorous verbiage on the back, but there's a lot of good information on the back, including the farmer who grew it. In this case, it was Tom Del Barba. Yeah.
We had one of these tastings, I guess, a couple of months ago with Daniel Ravier from Domaine Tempier, and we tasted the Tempier Bandol Rouge. I think actually the same vintage. I think it was the 2018, which is also, well, is Mourvedre.
Yes.
From another really great winery in a different part of the world. But these wines are
very different from one another.
They are very, very different. This wine, your wine is so much more, I don't want to use the wrong word, but it's kind of cleaner. It's purer than the Tempier wines are so kind of.
I would say that's.
Go ahead.
Yeah, Tempier wines for a long time, less so now, had a serious Brettanomyces problem, and if you got them early, they were like delicious and wonderful. But if you got a bad shipment that had seen some heat or some other stuff, they could be pretty barnyard, and that took away from the purity of the fruit. But having tasted those wines in their pure form, they're quite remarkable, and but they are different. The soils are different. The climate's different. Um, grape varieties like Mataro or Mourvèdre or Monastrell adapt to their climate and their place pretty seriously. Much like Bordeaux isn't California Cabernet, even though they're the same grape package. Mataro from California is really different than Mourvèdre from places like Tempier, which I love the wines from Tempier, by the way. Don't get me wrong.
Yeah, I mean, you could argue that, I mean, they're kind of the gold standard for the grape, right? Or
Yeah, they're the gold. Tempier is probably the gold standard for Bandol, for sure.
Right.
And Tempier was probably responsible for the rebirth of Mourvèdre in Bandol. So they're really part of. They probably set the people's understanding of the grape, even though you see it in Châteauneuf-du-Pape and other places. Nobody uses it to the extent that they do in Bandol.
Right,
and I'm
then,
fortunate to have one of the few really pure vineyards in California.
maybe the two wineries that are most famous for Mourvèdre would be Beaucastel and Tempier, and they both have Brett issues. So sometimes, not always. I love the wines. Don't misunderstand. They're two of my favorite wineries in the world, but they can be pretty funky. And so you kind of broad brush Mourvèdre as being this barnyardy, cow manure, Brettanomyces affected wine.
Which is the way some people think about Châteauneuf-du-Pape as well, and some of the other areas. When I was growing up in the wine business, we did a lot of Bordeaux tasting, and it was before we understood what Brettanomyces was and what it smelled like. But there were several Bordeaux chateaux who had just raging infections, and some Brett is stinkier than other Brett. Some Brett gives you this kind of cinnamony quality, and some is just like pure, unadulterated, fresh chicken manure. Just smells like chicken shit. And one of those, wines was Chateau Béchevel. And I can remember tasting with my father and his group when I was probably in my mid-teens, and having them do blind tasting, and they could all pick out Chateau Béchevel in a lineup of Bordeaux because of the terroir, because they all thought it had to do with the earth. Nobody really had any idea that it was an organism that grew in the wine in certain conditions. It was pretty funny. Yeah, we have obviously come a long way from the bacteriology standpoint in the wine business.
Well, and we've come a long way in a lot of ways in the wine business. We used. I always say, that job where I was the wine buyer before I was old enough to drink, we had all the first growth Bordeaux's on the wine list, but it was 1971 or 71 or 72. So that the wines we had on the list were 68s and 69s, probably 67, yep. 68, 69. Yeah. Those are atrocious wines, but we thought they were great. We didn't know any better. It was a Chateau Latour, so it must be great. It was Chateau Margaux, so it must be great. But have you ever tasted 68 Chateau Latour? It's abysmal.
I have. Yeah, we did a whole vertical of that. Yes, there was some pretty abysmal wines in there.
Well, there was really not a successful vintage in Bordeaux from 61 to 82.
Yeah.
I mean, they went a long time without making a good bottle of wine.
But what a way to go out. 59, 61 now, like pretty amazing. Yeah. So
why do you call it Mataro and not Mourvèdre?
It's the California name for the grape. It came into California with that name. Nobody knows exactly why, but there are listings of Mataro in California in nurseries from the 1880s. It probably came from what was then kind of part of a duchy that included Bandol and parts of Spain. And the port of Mataro is there. In fact, there's still, if you get Mataro and Rioja, if you see Mataro and Rioja, or excuse me, Morvedra and Rioja, it's still called Mataro. So it's likely that it came from Spain. There's a port of Mataro that it may have left from. It's hard to know how grapes got named in California, but they usually got named kind of about where they came from. I mean, so for instance, there were grapes that were named for people. There was Crab's Black Burgundy, which may have been Rufusco or Mondouse. Nobody knows for sure exactly what it was. So naming was kind of odd, but
in Spain in Spain they call it Mataro.
Mataro. Yeah, there you go.
It has the accent. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, my accent is probably not good when it comes to Spanish. Mataro. I actually like that better than Mataro. Mataro. Yeah. So yeah. So it's like I say, it probably came from Spain. It probably came with that name. So we adopted it here in California, and we're willing to run with it. Although, you know, you get people who are who question it. What is that? You know, so you know, it should be why aren't you calling it Morvedra? You know, yeah, et cetera, et cetera. Well, I say, well, why aren't I calling it Monastrell? You know, so it's our indigenous name.
The Mataro is 14.9% alcohol, according to the label. I assume that's vaguely accurate.
It's more than vaguely accurate. It's accurate based on what went into the bottle.
And talk about, I mean, it's a lot of alcohol, but it's not unbalanced. The wine I really like this wine a lot. I think it's beautiful and kind of for Mourvedre, kind of feminine and soft and just kind of a lovely wine. So 14.9 kind of seems kind of scary, but in this wine, it's not out of balance. The wine's perfectly balanced. And you can't, I mean, the world is what it is. If you want to make the wine dry, you have to let it ferment to dryness, and that creates whatever potential alcohol was originally in the grapes, right?
Yep. Yeah. So interestingly enough, you know, there are lots of ways to get to 14.9 alcohol or 15% alcohol. One of them is to pick the grapes like I do. I pick these grapes pretty early, you know, relative to when a lot of other people pick grapes. So I'm picking the grapes when they're fresher. They ferment to 14.9 naturally. The wine is dry. But there's some of my cohort that would pick these grapes at 30 bricks, which would give you a wine, if it could ferment out, would be 18 or 20% alcohol. And it would have a much riper flavor. But they get the grapes and they bring them in after they're dehydrated and add water back to them and acidity back to them because they lose acid to get the wine to ferment to dryness and to somewhere between 14 and 15% alcohol. It's commonly practiced with Bordelais grapes in California. The reason that a lot of Napa Valley Cabernets have that what I call mochi character. It's kind of mocha and oak because they're super ripe grapes that have been cut back with some water to give you that softness and that sort of plushy ripe character associated with it. But I like to think that my wines are fresher and brighter, in part because I picked them earlier, and the fermentations are honest fermentations from the point of picking to the end wine. So they have better acidity, they have more brightness, they have more life, and they tend to be in better balance.
Charlie Mahar asks, is there a T.H. White connection to the name Once and Future? Which I don't know what that refers to.
No, there isn't. I just wanted to be the future king. T.H. White's book is The Once and Future King. I did read it years ago, and it's about childhood King Arthur and all the legends kind of going forward with that. And it's a great book. I highly recommend it. But no, the name Once and Future came from sitting around the dinner table one night with my son and my wife, and I was carrying on about, well, okay, what are we going to call this? You may not understand how difficult it is to name a winery these days, because all the good names have been taken. I can remember trying to come up with a product name for a wine we were making at Constellation, and we went through 83 iterations before we found one that wasn't copyrighted by somebody else. So to name your winery, to have which is why wines have a lot of goofy names these days, like Highway 12 and things like that. So we're sitting around, and I said, well, once I made one in this way, and in the future I'm going to do it the same way. And my wife said, well, there's your name. I said, what do you mean? She said, Once and Future. And I said, oh, that's really interesting. So it's worked out pretty well, because once I made wines in a really small winery setting, focusing just on single vineyard wines, making them in a really traditional fashion. And obviously that's what I'm doing from now until as much future as I have.
There's this, I don't know if it's true or not, there's the story that Fred Franzia has a very large desk drawer, and it's full of, labels that he wakes up in the middle of the night with an idea for the name of a wine and knocks up a label, and he puts it in this desk drawer. And then when he has an opportunity for a silo full of wine, to float some oak chips in and add acidity and sugar to make some wine that he already has a label designed for, he creates the wine to match the label from, silos of wine in Modesto.
Well, it wouldn't entirely surprise me. Fred's an interesting guy. That sounds like something he'd probably do. When we found that when we went looking for names, you can name something, but if it's in the alcoholic beverage category, you can't use that name unless you pay somebody else to use it and they're willing to share it with you. What we found was that most of the good names are taken by beer companies, and the beer companies, particularly microbrews, have 20 or 30 different kind of labels to bring on or back up what they have. So, and they've copyrighted many of them. So it becomes a bigger issue. So Fred might well have a whole series of names that he's actually copyrighted and keeps in a drawer. Wouldn't surprise me.
I assume you and Paul Draper are friends?
Yep.
Is it fair to say that you and he in some ways pioneered the idea of high quality single vineyard Zinfandel?
I would guess that I would say there were pioneers before us, but we certainly built it into a franchise, so to speak. When you think about Paul, you have to think about who really started making Zinfandel at Ridge, and that was Dave Benyon. Right. And he made Zinfandel at Ridge in part because he was practicing to make great Cabernet. So much like Joe Swan, they kind of accidentally fell into great Zinfandel. Just a practice wine that turned out to be pretty darn good. Do that intelligently enough. And of course, there was Joe Swan, who was doing it as well. There were a couple of Zinfandels being made early in, even pre that, by people like Lee Stewart, who was the winemaker at then Napa Valley Souverain. And so there were some other people who had been making decent Zinfandel, and interesting Zinfandel that was in the high quality category, although I have to laugh a little bit when I think about this, because I released my first Zinfandel, was single vineyard designated Zinfandel, made much like these wines, in 1979. It was a 76 vintage, and I charged $7.50 for it. And you should have heard the screams. $7.50 for a Zinfandel? You've got to be out of your mind. Yeah, it was just like, really? Yeah, it's worth $7.50. It's worth more than that, but Ridge was selling wine for about the same price, and as was Joe Swan. But we did build the high quality franchise, but there were a lot more people involved. In about 23 years ago, a group of us got together. Don Reason from Ridge, Tom Burgess, myself, Kent Rosenblum, God, I can't remember who else. Oh, Jerry Seps from Storybook Mountain, and started ZAP, Zinfandel Advocates and Producers, because we didn't think Zinfandel was getting the respect it deserved, and we felt that was partly because people didn't taste Zinfandel. So we ended up putting on the largest single variety tasting in the world for many years. So that was the ZAP, the Zinfandel tasting. So there are at least 300 credible Zinfandel producing wineries now that are producing really good, high quality Zinfandel in small lots, of which I would say probably 30 of them, 10% of them are producing wine that's world-class for sure, maybe better.
When we had one of these events with Thomas Keller, and I wanted there to be a comfort level for him, because he's not a wine guy, he's a chef. I mean, he's a pretty knowledgeable guy about wine, but he's not a wine guy. Right. And I asked him, what kind of wines would you like to talk about? And I was floored when he said, I really love Zinfandel. And
Zinfandel's great food wine. Yeah.
Well, I said, so Larry Turley is an investor in his restaurant. So we tasted two of Paul's. We tasted Geyserville, Lytton Springs, and Turley Estate Zinfandel with Thomas. But he talked about his epiphany. He was a chef in New York, and one of the salesmen came by, and he tasted this. He didn't remember what the wine was, but he tasted this Zinfandel. It was the first time he realized that wine could be. He was a very young chef, but it was the first time he realized that wine could be something kind of compelling. That it was something more than just alcoholic beverage.
Yes, yeah. And Zinfandel tends to be a really good food wine. It tends to be pretty malleable. It has enough intensity to stand up to food like Thomas makes, which is very flavorful and precise. But it's not so overwhelming that it runs over it. So, and it's got a wide range of fruit characters that tend to, and sort of spice characters that tend to meld well, with food.
So would you be kind enough to talk to us about the Old Hill Ranch Zinfandel?
Yes, I love Old Hill Ranch. Old Hill Ranch, what a wonderful place that is. Sonoma Valley. It is a vineyard that was planted originally in the 1850s by William McPherson Hill, who was one of the early pioneers in California viticulture. He is reputed to have sold the most expensive peaches in California in the 1850s to gold miners who were desperate for fruit. He would sell a single peach for what in today's dollars is about $60 a peach. Very early, he planted this vineyard and got a reputation for producing some of the best wines in California. There was a British travel writer who came through that tasted wines that basically said, Mr. Hill's wines are the best wines I've tasted in California, and I've tasted many. So phylloxera comes along and Hill has to replant the vineyard. So this vineyard was replanted in 1885. When I first saw this vineyard was with Joe Swan when he was looking for more grapes. That would have been 1975. And it was in really bad shape. There were old cars and dead refrigerators and poison oak and buckbrush, and there was a hippie commune that sort of kept the vineyard just barely alive, that was living on the property. And Joe turned it down because he just figured that there was no future in this vineyard, and he wanted to, establish something that was a little bit more reliable. I got a call in 1981 from the guy who lived across the street, who was Otto Teller, who was like a bon vivant. He was the inheritor of the Hills Brothers fortune. He drove an XK150 Jaguar. He spent a lot of time at what my mother used to call the PU Club, which was a Pacific Union Club on Nob Hill. And he loved wine. And he said, "I've just bought this vineyard. Would you be interested in helping me revive it?" And I said, "Sure, why not?" So I got there. We basically dug out poison oak and buckbrush and got rid of the refrigerators. The commune was already gone. And what we found underneath this was this amazing piece of history that Mr. Hill had planted. And it has 21 different varieties planted in it. It's one of those vineyards that is a total throwback to the true history of California. You can almost judge the age of a vineyard based on how mixed up it is. During the period when Hill was first planting his vineyard, nobody knew what to plant in California. Can you imagine? They're coming into virgin territory. They may be growing some mission grapes, but there's nothing else growing. And there's a whole influx of people from East Coast nurseries coming in, and other places, other people getting grapes from Europe. So they're trying lots of things. So these vineyards have many different varieties in them. And part of what makes them really interesting are these many different varieties. Turned out that if you look at old vineyards, they seem to have a different planting pattern and a different mix depending on kind of what the soils and the space and the climate is, and probably what the proprietor at that time liked or what he thought he liked in terms of wine. So this vineyard has got a substantial amount of Grenache in it, interestingly enough. And this wine that you're tasting is probably as much as 8% Grenache, which is a substantial portion of the mixed blacks in this vineyard. I made this wine at Ravenswood, starting in 1981. When I first started making wine here, we were getting less than half a ton an acre off this vineyard. Today, it's been, Otto passed away, and his stepson, Will Buckland, took over. And Will and Phil Katuri began the farming and really went dedicated organic farming on it, rebuilt the soil profile in it, basically interplanted the misses. And today this vineyard gives us about 3.5 tons an acre. So it's, and it's split between Will Buckland and myself and my son, and Mike Officer at Carlisle will probably be getting some of the fruit as well. But it's a very special place, a very special vineyard. It's on alluvial fan, so well-drained, sort of cobbly soils, Tuscan Syrah soils, which are slightly reddish in color. Special place. And the wines always have, the spice, slightly camphorous note about them, lots of blackberries, and always have really pretty acidity and balance.
These vines are almost 150 years old.
Yep. Yeah, they look at, sometimes they look at, although, when I first started, it looked like they might have had another 10 years left in them. But now, that they've been taken care of and, and pampered, they look like, that they flourish. They really look like they might have another 100 years left in them.
And at 150 years old, they're still making 3.5 tons per acre. That's amazing.
Yep. No, it's pretty remarkable.
Is that partly because they're unrooted?
No, they're not unrooted.
Oh,
This is the first vineyard that was put on rootstock. It's all on St. George rootstock. It's probably the first vineyard put on rootstock in Sonoma, other than one of the Gunlock Bundschuh vineyards, which was planted on rootstock at a time well before phylloxera arrived in Sonoma, because Jacob, one of the, I don't know, it was a Bunchu or a Gunlock, I think it was one of the Gunlocks, had come through Missouri and had met the guy who was helping France with their phylloxera, who said, you know, it's going to come to California eventually, and you should plant on rootstock. So they did plant on rootstock. They planted on riparian rootstock, and it turned out because riparian rootstock is not drought resistant, and California gets much drier than it does in France or Missouri. They actually lost that vineyard and had to replant, and then ultimately had to plant again on rupestus rootstock, which is St. George, which has deeper roots, a big tap root, and it tends to be a fairly vigorous rootstock, so it produces quite energetic vines when they're young. Yeah.
And that's why so many people planted to St. George.
Yes. So this is
because they could make a lot. They could produce a lot of tonnage, which back then they were really just they weren't so much as much concerned about quality. They were more concerned about quantity. And the St. George root produced more fruit.
I don't think that's the only. I don't think that's the pure reason. I mean, vinifera grapes will give you tonnage for sure on their own roots, but I think that the real reason was that there really weren't very many options. I mean, we have many rootstock options available today, of which probably 4 are used. In California, they're adapted to different soils and they have different growth types. And Andy Walker just come out with a couple of new ones that are nematode resistant. So there are lots of, but I think that St. George was the one that was highly propagated and the one that was used most often. It's terrible for Cabernet. I mean, Cabernet is a vigorous vine anyway. And so it makes Cabernet so vigorous that it actually blows crop off the clusters. So it shatters terribly. Probably one of the reasons that Cabernet wasn't planted earlier in California was because people were doing bush vines on St. George, and it gave you almost no crop. So depending on the grape variety that you're working with, you either got more crop or less crop. But it was an energetic rootstock that didn't necessarily mate with everything particularly well, but did better than a lot of other rootstocks that were available.
I was reading earlier today, a very important wine writer was said that Zinfandel, he's tasting it was an article about some older Zinfandels. And he said, this is just an illustration that Zinfandel has to be drunk within 6 to 7 years.
Well,
I think he needs to taste this wine.
Yeah, I think that the problem with most articles like that is that the wines they taste were never made to age. They were made to be consumed really early. They were made in a lighter style. They were not aged in small cooperage. And in fact, if you taste many old California Cabernets, there are exceptions, of course, Inglenook, for instance, and Krug, for instance. But if you taste many old Cabernets, they just kind of taste weedy and thin. They don't really have any character, and they haven't developed any of the perfume that we associate with the Bordeaux varieties in different circumstances. So the trouble with those articles is that they were never intended to age. They're never intended to evolve. They were never made. Well, they didn't have any extended maceration time. They didn't have any barrel time. They didn't have any of the concentration that you get. They were picked frequently quite early to make sure that the wine was light and fresh and bright. So yes, of course, those wines don't age. And a lot of Zinfandel got a bad rap for that particular reason. But if you can taste my wines now I just tasted in 1977 that I made from the Sierra foothills of all places. That was really pretty. It was really nice. Yeah, it wasn't fruity anymore, but it had bottle bouquet and spice and pretty aromatics. You can taste old ridges that are terrific. The wines from the 70s and 80s and 90s from Ridge are terrific, as are my wines from the 80s and 90s. You taste 71 or 72 Joe Swan wines, and they're just like, wow, how are these wines still fresh and vibrant? So yeah, it really depends on the intent of the maker. And a lot of Zinfandel, because you couldn't sell it for very much money, didn't get a lot of good attention.
2018 is apparently a great vintage for Zinfandel. Is that true?
Yeah, great vintage for a lot of wines, actually. Yeah.
I mean, they're getting incredible press.
And well, they should get incredible press. It was about as perfect a year as you could ask for in California. We've had years that were drought years, which changes the nature of the way the vine grows and keeps the clusters small, and the wines sometimes get out of balance. We've had years that were overproduction years, really heavy production years, so you get thinner wines. But this year was like, and you get years where there are hot streaks that kind of desiccate things, like 96, for instance. But this year was like the perfect child. We had rain in the spring. It was the end of the drought. The vines were like exuberant about the water in the ground. It was cool in the beginning, and then it warmed up, and it stayed warm until August. And then the fog came in, and it sort of held off ripening in these grapes a bit. And it never, and in September, when we usually pick, and these days we get 110-degree days and get 3 of them in a row or 4 of them in a row. It's miserable. We had none of that. It was a perfectly balanced year. You could pick whenever you wanted to. There was no pressure. And the crop levels were kind of average, moderate. Yeah, that was terrific. There wasn't a lot of desiccation in the fruit. Yeah, it was from a fruit standpoint, from a growing year standpoint, and from a winemaker's sanity standpoint, it was really special.
We had a tasting not long ago with a South African winemaker named Evangelo. Do you know who Evangelo is? He's pretty esoteric, but they had, you have to really be into South African wine to have ever heard of him, but he makes really amazing wines. You would like him a lot. But he talked about they had 3 years of drought in a row, and if they'd had a 4th year, his winery might have gone under. But he might have gone crazy, because it had just been so, 3 long years of such tremendous difficulty and no relief in sight. And then thankfully 2018 came along.
Climate change has brought us changes for sure. And the change that is most disturbing is not so much that vintages are starting earlier. The grapes are budding out earlier, which puts them in threat of frost, because the frosts still come at the same time. But the real problem is these extremely hot days in consecutive series with low water available, particularly to the dry farm vines. Most of the vineyards I work with are dry farms, so they don't have any irrigation on them. So there's no way to even try to protect them. Not that, irrigation helps that much when you have 4 days that are 105 plus degrees. So that's the real difference these days from what I saw when I was beginning to make wine in the 1970s.
The repeated theme in these tastings is that it's not necessarily the world's not necessarily a warmer place, but the weather, whatever weather we have, is more extreme. So if it rains, when it used to rain an inch, now it rains 7 inches. If there's hail, it used to take 10% of the vineyard in Barolo. Now it takes 50% of the vineyard in Barolo. We had a tasting with a guy from Beaujolais, a winemaker from Beaujolais. said when he first started making wine in Beaujolais, his wines were 9 to 11% alcohol, and his 2020s are going to be 15% alcohol if he ferments them dry.
Yeah.
And a winemaker from Austria said when he first started, he harvested the grapes in October, and now he harvests them in August, and they're riper than they used to be in October.
Yeah.
I mean, it's
Yep.
just
Yeah,
reality.
there's definitely, we on the ground with the vines can certainly feel it. If you're at all sensitive, it's reflected.
Before we talk about,
I'm sorry.
before we talk about the Telechef, would you talk about why old vines are important or special?
Well, the first reason they're special is that they represent the heritage of California. They represent people who were here way before I was here and many others were here. They represent choices that were made early, and they represent the survivors. And there's a reason that they survive. They survive. The survivors of the old vines are in places that produced good wine, because that's what these grapes are made for. They were never table grapes. And in order to be commercially viable, they had to make wine that was better than average. And so that means that there was a selection. So the old vines that we work with now have survived Prohibition. They've survived depressions. They've survived, housing tracts. They've survived a lot of these things that tend to put vines out of commission because they were viable, good vineyards. But as they got older, particularly with Zinfandel, as it gets older, it just gets better. There are some grape varieties that actually don't get better as they get older. Cabernet doesn't get better as it gets much older, like these wines would be. The crop levels on Cabernet go down, way down. The berries get really small. The wines get a really hard tannin and a bitterness. And frequently, because the crop and the leaves are out of balance, they take on a very green kind of veggie character. Zinfandel, on the other hand, starts out as a fairly productive grape and with fairly large clusters. And as the vines get older, the clusters get smaller, the berries get smaller, which give you better skin to juice ratios. The vines get less vigorous. So the whole package comes more into balance. And the roots on these vines are so deep and so well intertwined in the subsoil that they are very consistent in producing high quality wine. So old vines are terrific for all those points, and the fact that really old vineyards have this really interesting package of grapes makes the flavor profiles in them even more interesting than they would be. But the wines tend to be more concentrated and more flavorful than younger vines would be.
How many people do you think have that Ravenswood logo behind you tattooed on their body somewhere?
Oh my. I can tell you that when I was out in the market working for Ravenswood, I would have people come up to me and they'd say, "Oh, you're the Ravenswood guy. I've got something I want to show you," which was code for "I'm taking my clothes off now." So I've seen at least 30 tattoos, which means that there are a lot more out there than that. I've seen tattoos around navels and orange and green. I've seen tattoos on inner thighs. I've seen tattoos on hips. I've seen tramp stat tattoos. I've seen tattoos as shoulder epaulets. I've seen tattoos on people's necks. I've seen them on their forearms. It's crazy, honestly. So yes, it's certainly the most tattooed logo in the wine business for sure.
One of my closest friends in the wine business, who is one of the people that didn't pass the Master Sommelier exam a couple of years ago, when she actually passed the Master Sommelier exam a couple of years ago, has it tattooed on the back of her neck right here.
Yeah.
And she's proud of it. I mean, she's really proud of it. I mean, she probably had that tattoo done 20 years ago, but she's not.
Well, there was a cult-like quality to Ravenswood in those years, in the best sense of cult. That there was a the wines were unique and they were special, and the logo was unique and special, and people recognize that.
I think your catchphrase too, no wimpy wines.
Yep.
I don't know if you came up with that or some marketing person came up with that, but at that time, it was the perfect time to say that, no wimpy wines, because what we were all looking for was an escape from all the wimpy wines like terrible Beaujolais and Matus and Lancers and, everything that, Blue Nun and all that we'd been drinking.
Well, the best part of that that phrase was that it was a total accident. It kind of came up naturally. I told my then business partner, when he wanted me to make White Zinfandel, that I did do Pink, Sweet, and Wimpy, and that I was going to do something else. And he and I sold most of the wine ourselves in those days, and he was calling on an account in San Francisco, California wine merchant, a guy named Greg O'Flynn.
Yeah.
And Greg says to him, "When are you going to make a White Zinfandel? White Zinfandel's hot." He says, "I need more, and I'm sure you'll make a good one." And Reed looks at him and says, "I'm sorry, that's not going to happen." Joel's adamantly opposed to it. In fact, he says, he's got a sign over the fermenters that says no wimpy wines allowed. And it probably would have ended right there, except Greg called me up and he said, "I'm coming to Sonoma." He says, "I really love to taste your wines. And by the way, I want to see the sign." And I said, "The sign? What sign's that, Greg?" He says, "The one over the fermenters. It says no wimpy wines." And I'm going, "Oh man, there is no sign," but I'm not telling him that. I'm thinking, Reed's been there. And so I call up Reed and I say, "Okay, Greg's coming up. And apparently there's a sign that says no wimpy wines allowed over the fermenters. Do you know anything about that?" And he said, "Yeah, I might have said that." And I said, "Well, if you don't want to look like a bald-faced liar, you better have a sign made, by the time Greg gets here." And so Reed had a sign made by the time Greg arrived, but it was like perfect. It was exactly what we were doing. Is exactly, my attitude about, White Zinfandel and other sort of sweet wines. Not that there's anything really wrong with White Zinfandel. It's just not my kind of wine. And so we managed to parlay that for a long time. We actually translated it into different languages and put it on bumper stickers. Somebody came to me and said, "Why can't I put a bumper sticker that says no wimpy wines on my car?" Said, "The police will be stopping me all the time." So we said, "Well, what language don't the police know?" So we came up with Latin, nullum vinum flacitum. And we had a really good time talking to Latin scholars, trying to figure out which Latin to use. So there were lots of options. We had, and perhaps the best one was no vinos sin huevos, no wines without.
That's funny.
Yeah.
So there's no telling how many different vintages and bottlings of your wines I've tasted. So I feel qualified to ask this question. Is this 2018 Taldeschi Zinfandel the best wine you've ever made?
Oh, wow. I don't think about my wines in those terms, but this is pretty darn good. I don't know this is the best one I've ever made. I'd have to go back and taste them all again. But it is among the best wines that I've made. It was a great vintage. It's an amazing vineyard. I've been working with the Taldeschi Vineyard since 1982. This is a small little portion of it called Frank's Block. Frank's Block is the oldest block on the vineyard, planted in 1904. It's Cabernet. It's Zinfandel, Alicante Bochet, and Carignan. And the Zinfandel I picked, kind of riper than ordinarily Zinfandel. That's because the Alicante and the Carignan ripened later than Zinfandel, and they're a little they're probably just on the edge of being what you'd call ripe. Most people wouldn't pick them for wine at that point, but I used that and blended it into the Zinfandel, and the counterpoint of all those flavors in the wine give you these incredibly vibrant, interesting, delicious wines. So it's certainly, if you trust the wine writers, it's probably not the best wine I've ever made. I think this one got 96. The highest score I've ever gotten for a wine is 98. But in my opinion, this is right up there in the top echelon. It's pretty delicious.
Well, I mean, obviously I was not serious about that. I mean, it was kind of an indirect way of saying that I think it's one of the best Zinfandels I've ever tasted.
Well, I'm so glad you think so. Yeah, because
Well,
it's
in honesty, it's hard. It's really hard to imagine how a wine made from this grape could be superior to this wine. You know,
well,
so
I like the sentiment, but
so you can intellectually figure out that Romanée-Conti from a great vintage is going to be something extraordinary, or Barolo Bernate from a great vintage and a great winemaker is going to be something extraordinary, or Grange is going to be something extraordinary, that are, angelic, magical wines. It's maybe that's not fair, but you don't really think of Zinfandel as capable of producing something as profound as Grand Cru Burgundy or Grange, or you know what I'm trying to say.
I know exactly what you're trying to say.
But here you have this wine, and I don't want to sound ridiculous, but I think if we had a glass of 2018 Tedeschi Zinfandel and 2018 Chateau Latour, they wouldn't taste alike, but the quality is not different.
Yes, I would agree with that, and I think that when Zinfandel is in its best iterations, made by somebody who does it well, it is a world-class wine. It will stand with any of those wines that you mentioned. There's a lot of Zinfandel that isn't made that way, and of course, if you taste Romanée-Conti, you know how good Burgundy can be, but you sleep with a lot of bad wines before you get the beauties, and in Burgundy. So there are some great wines made in Burgundy, but there's also a lot of wine that's not very good made in Burgundy. And unfortunately, that's true of Zinfandel, except that we don't have the Romanée-Conti of Zinfandel quite yet. There are people that are making great wines. I mean, Carlisle makes great wines.
Yep.
Morgan's making great wines. And those will become the standard bearers as the world goes forward with Zinfandel. But it's what we hope for in California, because it really is our wine, our grape. Yeah, it comes from Croatia. Yes, they grow Primitivo in Italy. But neither of those places produce wines at the quality and level that comes out of good California Zinfandel.
Who makes better wine, you or your son?
I do, of course. No, he makes great wine. No, I am very proud of Morgan. He is like one of the really talented and capable young winemakers in California. And he's an MW. I mean, this kid has earned his spurs. Getting a Master of Wine degree is not easy. There are only 200 and some odd of these people in the world in an organization that's been going on for a long time. It is very difficult. So he knows his stuff, and he is super talented, and he's done something I've never done. He made the number 10 wine in the world for the Wine Spectator a year ago or 2 years ago. So he's making good wine. Yeah, so he's actually a better winemaker than I am. But it's not a competition.
Well,
I love what he does, and he's very supportive of what I do.
I was just hoping to make you laugh with that question, but I mean, you do make wine from the same vineyards.
We do.
The two of you do source grapes from the same vineyards to make wine. So yes, how does your approach to Old Hill Ranch Zinfandel differ from Morgan's approach to Old Hill Ranch Zinfandel?
I take the section of the vineyard that is legally Zinfandel. meaning it's 75% of the vineyard, 75% Zinfandel. Morgan has made a policy of mostly not making Zinfandel, although he does a really beautiful, just over $20 bottle of Zin. That is his Sonoma County it's his Old Vine Zinfandel from Old Vines all over California, which is Zinfandel. But when he makes these single vineyards, he's making the California heritage wine that these vineyards probably intended to make. I would have started there if I could have gotten away with it. But in 1976, if you made one of these vineyards that was what we referred to as a mixed black vineyard in those days, and you just called it a red wine, people thought it was a jug wine, and it wouldn't have been important. So I had to make Zinfandel. But now the wine audience is way more sophisticated. I mean, you have you probably have an idea, Hoyt, about how much the wine world has changed and people's knowledge about wine has changed. So Morgan can make heirloom wines, heritage wines from these old vineyards. So his wines tend to have more of the secondary grape varieties in them than mine do. They range from 50% Zinfandel to 70% Zinfandel. And that changes the character, the structure, and the overall flavor of the wine. He's also using stainless steel, and while he does punch down some of them, he pumps over some of them. He also plays with whole cluster fermentations. I'm using really small fermenters. I mean, like 6 ton is my biggest fermenter, and literally they're redwood, and I punch them down by hand. It's pretty funny if you during the winery during Crush, you go down his basically state-of-the-art winery, and you get to my section of the winery, and it's like a historical winemaking museum by comparison to what his is. It's kind of amusing. When the interns come in, they take one look at it and they go, wow, we didn't know what we were getting into.
Well, isn't that where you'd want to intern? Is a place that taught you those old
Oh yeah,
the time-honored techniques?
No, for the most part, they're all thrilled with the whole thing. So they get a wide range of experience. They get to see how I'm making wine, and then they see how Morgan's making wine, and they're kind of neck deep in it.
So I have, you promised me 4 more minutes of your time, although you logged on early, so I've already had more of your time than you promised me.
It's okay. That was gratis. I was logging on.
I have, I guess, 2 questions left. And one is off topic. I'm sure you know John Wettlaufer.
Yep.
Is he okay? I heard he was really sick.
I don't have a new update on him, but yes, you're right. He was very sick. So I can't tell you the latest on him.
I was at All Seasons Cafe years ago and went next door to get some wine to have with dinner. And he was opening the Wine Advocate for the first review of their wines.
Oh, wow.
And the Marcus M wines, the first time Robert Parker reviewed their wines.
Wow.
He gave them 99, 99, and 100 points for the 3 Chardonnays they made.
Yep. No.
And he learned this as we were walking in the door of the store. So we bought a bottle of each of those wines, those 3 single vineyard wines.
That was before the price went to
we paid $50 for them or something like that.
Yeah.
Or not even that, probably.
That probably wasn't that.
And we had the 3 Chardonnays with dinner, and they were remarkable. I don't know if they were 100-point wine, but they were remarkable, young, kind of almost painful to taste wines. But he came. We loved the restaurant so much we went to lunch the next day, and we were having lunch, and he walked through. He left that night with a bottle of Chalon Reserve Chenin Blanc in his hand. I really love that wine. And he said, well, I'm taking it to my tasting group tonight.
Yeah.
And I've never tasted it before. I said, this is a long time ago. I said, I think it's one of the best Chenin Blancs in the world. And he literally laughed out loud at me that I thought Chalon Reserve Chenin Blanc was one of the best Chenin Blancs in the world. That was such an absurd statement.
Yeah,
Uh,
well,
But I mean, I'm sure you know, because
Chalon made really amazing wines. That was when Graf was in
they
charge.
did. They made, and so anyway, the next day we're at lunch and he walks through and I said, so how was the Chalon Reserve Chenin Blanc? He said, it's one of the best Chenin Blancs I've ever tasted in my life.
Yeah, no, really
And-
good.
But
He
he
did
was
a
going,
Pinot
he was going in to give notice. He quit that day because he didn't need to be the wine manager at the store there anymore because he'd gotten the 99, 99, and 100 point rating from Wine Advocate for those first 3 wines that he and Helen made.
Scores like that are liberating.
They,
In those days,
So-
they made a huge difference. Less so now, but in those days, it was a
well,
huge-
you know, everything gets 98 points these days. So can I ask you 2 more questions?
Sure.
What's the difference between 96 points and 98 points?
Opinion. There's really no difference between 96 and 98 points at the end of the day. And in fact, in my opinion, any wine above 90 points all the way to 100 points could be mixed up in any particular way. I once did a tasting where I took a whole series of Cabernets that had all gotten 90 to 100 points. And I put them in front of tasters who were very experienced tasters who knew what they were tasting and just said, score these wines on a 100-point scale. And they spread the wines out between 80 and 100 with no relative no relative order relative to what they had been scored in the past. Yeah.
Well, you were part of that. We talked about this the last time. You were part of that book about the blind tasting of the Zinfandels with you and the,
Yep.
Yeah, and where you tasted each other's wines blind and ranked them, and mostly everybody ranked their own wine last or something like that.
Well, it wasn't that bad. It wasn't that bad, but
What was that book called?
that was called Angel's Visits.
Angel's Visits, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
And so, I mean,
It was reissued as a book called Zinfandel as well.
really,
Yeah.
you know, I mean, tonight I'm tasting these 2 wines, these 2 Zinfandels, and the Old Hill Ranch is fabulous. I mean, it's a fabulous wine. But tonight, the Telechef is another order to me at this moment in this room with the lady's perfume that's sitting across the way from me or whatever that's affecting the way the wine tastes. Tomorrow night, if I open these 2 bottles of wine, it might be the Telechef that's amazing, but the Old Hill Ranch that is transportive.
Yeah, well, the Old Hill always takes a little longer to evolve. The Telechef tends to reach its stride earlier.
So will you tell us the story again of when you were 10 years old and met Joe Heitz? Do you remember the story I'm referring to?
I do, but I'll be back in just a second. I gotta take a break.
Unless anyone on the screen has a question they'd prefer I ask to end the evening with, this is a really funny story. Some of you may have been with us the last time we were with Joel and have heard it, but it's good enough to hear it again. I have to be a little careful about how much tasting I do because I have to drive home after this. But it's hard sometimes to control my appetite for these amazing wines.
Okay, I'm back. So Joe Heitz, oh my goodness. Joe Heitz was an interesting guy, made some fascinating wines, finished wines from the Hansel collection. So some of the wines that he was most famous for, not Martha's Vineyard, of course, but were Pinot Noir and a Chardonnay. that had actually been started at Hanzel and were part of the Hanzel project that he purchased when Zellerbach died. But Joe Heitz could be irascible. He had a reputation for being a bit cranky, and somewhere along, but he also was very much involved with the then wine scene, and the then wine scene revolved around knowledgeable wine people, and they were places like the Berkeley Wine and Food Society, the San Francisco Wine and Food Society, and he had just kind of rebuilt one of his cellars, and he wanted everybody to come up and see it and taste his wine. So he put on, he was very conscious about publicity and PR. And so he invited the Wine Society, the Berkeley Food and Wine Society, and some other people up for an opening of the cellar, to show the cellar and have lunch and and kibitz. One of the people who sold him grapes was Barney Rhodes. He was part of that. He actually owned Martha's Vineyard for a while, and then he owned the Fay Vineyard, which Heitz made wine from. And Darcy David, another guy, was part of that. But so my father was part of that group, and so I was invited. This was kind of a family event, so I was invited along. And my father had taught me to taste when I was quite young, and so we're walking through the winery, and Joe Heitz is showing a wine, and I'm smelling this wine, and it smells a little like burlap bags. And I say to Joe Heitz, he's taking questions, and I say to Joe Heitz, I say, Mr. Heitz, has this wine been through a malolactic, or is it going through a malolactic fermentation? And he looked at me, and he looks down at me, and he says, what's a little shit like you want to know anything like that for? And then he just turns away and proceeds to talk about something else. And my father, and I'm like going, whoa. My father puts his hand on my shoulder and he says, it's okay. He doesn't know the answer.
I don't think you told us that part of the story the last time. There was also the previous, earlier in the day, you had commented on the eucalyptus and mint in the Martha's Vineyard Cabernet.
Oh, yeah.
He said something dismissive about that too.
Yeah, no, he said, he says, there are no eucalyptus trees within miles of this vineyard, which turns out not to be true at all.
There's eucalyptus everywhere. I spent a week in his guest house. You can hardly, your waffles in the morning smell like eucalyptus.
Yes. No. Yeah, Martha's Vineyard. The informing character of Martha's Vineyard is eucalyptus. One of the best of all Martha's Vineyards ever was the 1968, and it was, I think, the second or third leaf of that vineyard. When wines aren't supposed to be very good, but they had pulled the clusters back to one cluster per vine. So you had this great intensity, and 1968 was a great year in California in terms of balance and flavor profile. So it turned out but the eucalyptus was a real thing. It was super minty. Sometimes eucalyptus can be minty, but sometimes it can just smell like aromatic bark that just like, it's kind of dry and it's kind of weird. But Martha's Vineyard seems to have the good uke going for it.
Well, you were kind in your description of him. I think if you said irascible, and I would say he was a horse's patoot or something like that. And I had a couple of dealings with him that we talked about before. I mean, there's the famous night he had 500 people in a hotel room in Detroit for a tasting of his wines, and he stopped up at the bar, had too many martinis, and went back to his room and went to bed. And all these people sitting there, at 500 people in a ballroom, there was no tasting because Joe Heitz was drunk.
He was a complex character, but he made some great wines in his career. And he certainly furthered the cause of Napa Valley over the years.
Well, he told the story at the event we had in Nashville at my restaurant. He told the story about when the 85, I think it was the 85 Martha's Vineyard got 100 points from the Wine Spectator, and maybe it was the first or second wine to ever get 100 points from California. And back then, he sold all his wine through the door of the winery. He didn't have any distribution. At least this is the story he told. So when he opened the door at 9 o'clock Wednesday morning to start selling his wines, there were like 500 people standing in line at the door wanting to buy the wine because of the 100-point rating.
Yeah.
And I think he said he sold it for $7 a bottle.
Yep.
And he sold like, half what he made for $700 a bottle. And there were still hundreds of people standing in line. So he doubled the price and sold half what was left. And then he doubled the price again. And then I think he said he kept like 250 cases, but he sold the last few cases, he sold for like 10 times what he sold it for earlier that day.
Sounds like the French approach to the tranche system.
Yeah.
They release a little, figure out how well it's received, release it more, the higher price, to determine what the price is. That's a very Joe Heitsian story.
Well,
but it is true. In those days, scores made a huge difference. I remember getting my first big Spectator score was a 95 on a Cabernet that I made in 1982, and it was amazing. You could see the circulation of the Spectator based on the requests that I got for those wines.
Right.
It started out on the East Coast and just spread across the United States. It was stunning. Like that wine was gone in like one day. I mean, it was like 300 cases of wine. I had no idea what had happened, but people kept phoning and asking for the wine. It was like really fascinating.
When we got
95 points now, and it's hardly a blip on the radar screen.
Right. Well, there's just hundreds and hundreds of 100-point wines now, and there used to be none.
Yeah.
But when we got the Grand Award from Wine Spectator at our restaurant in Nashville, it's before the internet, so we would only find out when the magazine came out. Yep. And I got a phone call from a disc jockey in Australia, in Sydney, saying, "How can you have a great wine list in Nashville? I didn't think you wore shoes there." and that's how we found out we'd won the award. And about the next morning, the phone just started ringing off the wall from all over the world, people wanting reservations. I mean, people all over the world wanting reservations. I went in the bar one night, Mickey Mantle was in the bar wanting to have dinner and drink Old Bordeaux. I mean, it's crazy the effect something like that can have. One party one night in the bar, they're in the bar, they wanted to talk to me about the wine list. They had the Wine Spectator list of the 100 best wines ever made, or whatever that list is. And they said, "Do you have any of these?" I said, "Well, we have a lot of them." They said, "We'd like to have some of them with dinner." It was a party of four. They spent $30,000.
Woo, man.
But they had 47 Cheval Blanc and 21 Yquem and 71 Romanée-Conti, and I mean,
well, they didn't have a clue of what they were tasting.
I don't know. I think they knew, but it's just amazing the impact of something like that.
Yeah.
And I didn't run their credit card first. I served them all the wine and then gave them the bill. Imagine. Well, Joel, thank you. I knew this was going to be a really special event, a special evening for everyone, for me personally, and for everyone, because your stature, I'm old enough to understand your stature in the wine industry in the world and in California especially. And congratulations to you, and thank you so much for, congratulations to you for these extraordinary wines that we've tasted tonight. And thank you for taking the time to join us. It means a lot. I'm honored by your time. I really am.
Well, thank you, Hoyt. I really appreciate your being here, and thank you all for drinking wine. God knows I never could be a good winemaker if I didn't have good wine drinkers to support that whole process. And I have been very fortunate. I ended up in the world at the right time with the right skills. Yeah, I'm a lucky, lucky man. And thank you. Thank you for sharing my wines with everybody else too.
It sounds like you had the right father too.
I was lucky from that standpoint. I had the right mother, a nuclear chemist who bought our first bottle of wine. 1952, she bought a Chateauneuf de Pape that rocked their world. Yeah, and that started them down the road of wine, and that started me down the road of wine, and that started Morgan down the road of the wine. It's amazing how one bottle of wine can change generations.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, everybody has that epiphany moment with an amazing bottle of wine.
It is true.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Wakes you up. Well, thank you. Thank you, Joseph. Joel, and thank you everyone for joining us tonight.
Yeah, thank you all.
See everyone soon. Thank you.
We didn't do any questions, but does anybody have any questions that we haven't done?